I'm Jonathan Tomkin from the University of Illinois. So one of the concerns with energy production is that it also produces carbon dioxide. We could use renewables, or we could simply use less energy. There's lots of ways in the modern world that this could be achieved. Let's think about lighting, for example. Traditional electric lighting uses incandescent bulbs. More recently, we've seen the uptake of fluorescent bulbs. And then more recently still, LED light-emitting diodes have been used in commercial and home lighting. These three bulbs produce the same amount of light, but use radically different amounts of energy. The incandescent bulb uses about 4 times as much electricity as the fluorescent bulb, which in turn uses twice as much energy as the LED. So we can get the same product, that is the same amount of light produced, for less energy. Of course, there is a trade-off, and right now LEDs are much more expensive than fluorescents, which are also more expensive than incandescents. But the prices of LEDs and fluorescents have been dropping rapidly in the last few years, and it's already well past the point where switching to LEDs or fluorescents away from incandescents saves money over a pretty short period of time. In fact, there are lots of ways that we could both reduce our energy footprints and also reduce the amount of money we spend. Different technologies have different paybacks, and it's been estimated that there are some things like changing light bulbs, or by increasing the energy efficiency of heating and cooling systems, or by adding insulation to buildings. We could actually both reduce the amount of energy we used, and also, because we're reducing energy, save money. And so in fact there would be a net gain, both financially and environmentally. This is in contrast to switching to renewables, for example, which would cost us money, although that would also reduce our carbon footprint. There is another issue when we increase our efficiency, however. The idea of perverse incentives suggests that the cheaper something is, the more we will use of it. For example, we might think about a buffet. I think, like most people, I tend to overeat when there's a free, unlimited amount of food. So the price of food is at rock bottom and the amount is sky high. If we make our systems more efficient, then we actually reduce the need to worry about the cost. So an example might be is that if lighting becomes cheaper, because we've switched from incandescents to LEDs, instead of reducing the amount of energy we use, we might simply prefer to create more light. Now, of course, this is good from a personal utility point of view, but doesn't necessarily mean that we will do much to reduce our carbon footprint. So we have to be aware that human nature can sometimes undermine some of these technological fixes. In many places around the world, however, there's a lot of scope for reducing residential electricity use. Here we can see in this graph that California has shown a very different trajectory to the rest of the United States in the amount of energy that it uses. The reason for this is that California has very strict residential energy use standards. Despite those strict standards, other places are more efficient yet. So, for example, the average Danish household uses about half as much as the average Californian household in their day-to-day use of household electricity. So for many places in the world, there's lots of scope for reducing our energy demand. And in fact, this has been happening in many industrialised countries. Carbon dioxide produced by the United States, for example, which has historically been the biggest single producer of carbon dioxide, has been flat for quite a long time. Notice here in this graph that China's production of carbon dioxide has increased enormously in the last few years, to the extent where the amount produced by the United States and China, which are now the 2 biggest producers of carbon dioxide in the world, are about the same. Don't forget, though, that China's population is around 4 times that of the United States, so the average person in China has a quarter the carbon footprint of the average person in the United States. Still, the United States has shown consistent improvement in the last few decades. Because of these energy efficiencies, because we have better lighting, heating and transport systems, the amount of carbon dioxide produced per person in the United States is actually lower now than it has been in decades. So if you look at this graph, you can see that the current production of carbon dioxide per person in the United States is lower than at any time since the 1960s. This trend of carbon dioxide use is actually quite widespread across industrialised economies. CO2 use per person is going down, and the total amount of CO2 produced in these countries is stabilising. One example of this stabilisation is that the United States is seeing less vehicle miles travelled per person than in recent years. We've talked about peak oil or peak uranium. Maybe we've seen peak car also in the United States. So it is possible. We do have enough energy to see us through the rest of the century. We even probably have the technology to make the amount of carbon dioxide produced be relatively modest. It will make things slightly more expensive, a cost that can be borne well enough by advanced economies, but perhaps not so well by developing economies. Of course, developing economies have another big concern in the 21st century when we talk about sustainability, and that concern is food. Can we produce enough to feed the new billions that are coming? We'll find out next week.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.